Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. That's Alan, the Comic Collector Geek, and this is the Wednesday video where I answer your questions. So every Wednesday, I answer people's questions. They put it in the comments below, and I answer the questions the next week. If you have a question you want answered, put it in the comments below, and I will answer it next week. So some really great questions this week. I got some cool things to show, some history to impart on you, some fun stuff. So let's get right into it. The first question comes from Kay Munin, who asks, since you touched on the subject of comic stores closing in the 90s while answering my questions, with so many more stores closing fairly recently, do you think there will ever come a time when comic stores are a thing of the past? What happens to the comic book industry without comic stores? Always thanks for answering my questions. Okay, so I don't actually believe comic stores will become a thing of the past. But I do see, I actually see a couple things. And yesterday, I'll give you an experience that I had, and it'll kind of relate to this question. So I was tortured. What I mean by that is my wife forced me to go shopping with her. So there's a big mall here called Rideau Center, and I was forced to go to that mall. But fortunately, I was able to sneak away. So I was able to get away, and while she was looking at other things like clothing and boring stuff that I'm totally not interested in, I was able to sneak away. And there, inside the mall, there is this massive store which has comics in it. It's actually a comic store. It has coins as well, and it has Funko Pops. It has stamps. It has everything collectible in this one store. It's actually 2 levels. It's this massive store within the mall. So I was just chilling out there and hanging out there while she was clothes shopping, and I was like looking at the coins. I was looking at all these comics. I was trying to find, all the comics were junk. I was like so disappointed. There was nothing in terms of the comics. But that I see is the future, where you get these bigger stores that kind of cater to multiple interests. Maybe not all 100% as well as the current comic stores we have, but I do see those stores being popping up and becoming something where, various collectors can come in, like collectors of Funko Pops, collectors of the toys, anime, and comics. So I do see that as a sort of a new trend. But I also see comic shops as being aware of the waning of the comic book industry. And a lot of shops are now offering Funko Pops, and they do the gaming stuff as well, like Magic the Gathering and Warhammer and all these other things that they can bring in customers to support the comics that they sell. So I do see that that's kind of the trend, that you have a lot of the shops that are surviving are becoming stronger by kind of leveraging other things to sell to maintain their businesses. And generally, that's what always happens in business. You get the sort of, in the 90s, you had like thousands of shops, and a lot of them didn't really understand business. And when things got bad, the good shops remained. And the ones that were not so savvy about how the industry was changing, they folded up. Now, the ones that survived are probably bought out a lot of those shops that went out and ended up with really great inventory and probably did really well as a result. So it's really a matter of like how well the companies that, or people that manage these stores do. If they're fairly savvy and fairly flexible about the way the market is changing, then they will survive. If they're not, they'll probably go out of business. And that's one of the great things. It's creative destruction of capitalism, which I actually embrace. Another thing that I do see, and this is a new trend that's really been taking off in the last few years, is people are not necessarily going to a shop or going or buying even from the big comic companies. They're buying from independent publishers. And what I mean by that is Kickstarter campaigns and things where people are doing crowdfunding as a way to sell comics. And I see that more and more as a positive trend within the comic book industry. And a lot of these artists and producers can produce whatever they want to produce, and they can produce stuff that, you know, doesn't have to like go through some committee to decide whether or not it gets published. And really what's happening is you get these artists that are creating stuff that is fun and engaging, and if they're good at it, they do really well and they keep on, you know, building on their successes. And if they're not good on it, then they go out of, they don't go anywhere. So and the market can really decide that. And, you know, so these projects get funded or not funded based on the quality of the work that these people are producing. So I see that as a new trend as well. So I always feel like comics will be something that happens in the future. And also we see even with the way people who don't have access to stores, how they buy. Like you see shops like My Comic Shop, which is a company I mention fairly often on this channel because I buy a lot of things from them. What they'll do is they will act as a distributor, because they will allow people to order from their online store and have pull lists. So what you might have is a virtual store which ends up sending you your monthly pull list, probably all at once, and you get monthly boxes. And I see that as being another thing that is happening. So if you're, you know, you say, hey, I'm interested in these titles, they collect it, they give you the 20% off or 30% off, and then they send it to you. That's something else that's happening. So there's a bunch of things that, you know, the market is changing. There might not be as many stores, but the stores will be better, offer more services, and then there's other options that have been allowing people that don't necessarily have access, who don't live in a big city, to get comics as well. So there's a bunch of things that are happening that I actually see as positive. It's just a different, maybe not what we're used to, but things, you know, it's changing in a good direction. So that's my long-winded answer to your question. The next question comes from William Barrett. I'm interested in when newsstand and direct edition became predominant and why. Okay, so newsstands editions really were the dominant way of buying comics up till 1979. And then they came out with what's called a direct edition. Now, a direct edition would go to comic shops, which were starting to open up at the end of the 70s. And you could also order direct from the publisher to your house if you really wanted to. And I did that, for example, with Mad Magazine and other magazines that I collected. So those were the options: newsstand or direct. And that was after 1979. At that point, 94% of all comics published in 1979 were newsstand. You'd go to your your local newsstand where you buy your paper and you would buy your comics there. And only 6% were direct. Now, fast forward a few years to 1982, and it was these comic shops were starting to appear more and more frequently, and you get 80% of your comics from newsstands and 20% from direct. 86 was the year that it became 50-50. So it's very rapid that these comic stores were being created and gradually reducing the amount of comics that people were buying from the newsstands. So it was 86, it was 50-50. Fast forward a few more years in the 90s, what happened was comic stores gained the ability to basically order a certain number of books and get access to titles. They could sort of independent kind of distributors themselves. They could become little newsstands. So these comic stores would basically buy a bunch of books, and if you bought 10, you could you could become part of the distribution route, or whatever number it is. You have to buy a certain number, and then you could be part of, get access to the distributors and get the books into your stores. And because of those rule changes, a whole bunch of mom and pop shops started appearing all over the place. Like thousands of these mom and pop kind of comic stores started appearing during the 90s. And at that point, 85% of the comics were being sold through comic stores, and about 15% were still through the newsstand. As the 90s boom kind of happened, it switched from up to 90% were from direct and 10% newsstand. So that was 95. By 2013, fast forward many, many years now, the newsstand version of comics basically almost wiped out completely. There's very few comics sold on newsstands anymore. About 1%, and 99% are sold direct. Now you're probably wondering, why is it? Why that complete switch, especially after the bust of the 90s, where a lot of these comic stores had gone out of business. I was just talking in the previous question about how comic stores were going out of business. Well, part of the thing that changed as well was the mentality of the collector. Now, even when there was newsstands and only newsstands, there was always the collector element to comics. It wasn't that you just buy them and read them. There was always a group of people who bought them and collected them. Well, that philosophy about collecting comics became more and more predominant into the 90s. And collectors started holding on to more and more of those books. And with comic stores holding on to back issues in the 90s, that collector kind of behavior kind of grew and solidified. So what happened was collectors preferred to get their comics in minty condition. And once that happened, people generally kind of veered away from the newsstands, because usually in the newsstand versions of the comics, they were pretty beat up. Like I remember going to newsstands and they put in those spinner racks, and everyone would kind of like, you want to look through the comics on the newsstand, and there would be that bar. And as you're flipping through, you're bending all the books. People are just destroying all the books that were on these spinner racks. And the bar would also put a dent across whatever comic was pressed up in the front position. And there's a bunch of things. Newsstands were not necessarily the best places to buy high quality comics or high grade comics. So collectors kind of more and more gravitated to stores. And stores also offered access to back issues and pull lists and stuff like that. You couldn't really do that through the newsstand. So there was a bunch of incentives that led collectors, and that became the majority of the people in the hobby, to go to the stores. So that's kind of why 99% of the comics are really bought through the stores. I hope that explains it. Yeah, so let's get into the next question. It's M. LeBlanc and LeBond. Hi, Alan. Recently, I watched Jerry the Jitterbug's video series about restoration of Action Comics number 63. He did a bunch of things to restore the book, including sealing tears with Tengoju paper, marrying the first wrap, recasting the whole cover by adding pulp paper. Fascinating stuff. What I don't understand, however, is that when he got his book back from CGC, it was a 5.0 conserved grade, not restored, not qualified. Can you illuminate me on the difference between gray, purple, and green labels from CGC? And why didn't his book get the restored grade? Which one of these grades is the least or most preferable? Do you own any conserved grade slabs? So yes, I do have a few conserved grade slabs. And first of all, it's kind of a weird question in a way, or a weird thing that happens with conserved grades. So there's, first of all, let's understand what green label is versus restored. Restored books are ones where there's been something that's been done to the book to either improve the look of the book, or yeah, usually to improve the look of the book. And green labels usually are something like, you can see the one right behind me, right there. It's a green label, where there's something missing. So if there's centerfold missing, or like a coupon cut out, something like that, it usually gets the green label. And there is certain negativity associated to that, because, you know, people don't like things missing. It used to be the case that you could also get a green label for signature copies, if because CGC didn't offer verification services for their comics, and if it was signed Todd McFarlane across the cover, well, they couldn't verify that, so they would give you the green label. Now they have recently changed that policy, and now they're actually giving those books a gold label where they're certifying the signatures. So that's been a change, but for now, green label means that there is something missing with the book. Staples replaced, things like that. So something's wrong with the book in that way. Restored books means that there's been something like staples cleaned, staples replaced, stapled, trimming, color touch, tear seals, all these kind of things. Now, within restored, you got to go that there's different levels of restoration. There's A, B, and C levels of restoration, which is amateur, which is A. A is professional, B is semi-professional, and C is amateur. So A, B, and C. So the quality of the restoration is seen in those three things. Now, there is actually a fourth level, which is higher than A, which is conserved. So if you think about conserved as being just a higher level of restoration, that's probably the best way. Because what it is professional restoration, which can, for the most part, be removed. Not always. Like, sometimes books are trimmed or have like things that are replaced on them, but generally there's methods that you employ when you're conserving that are considered professional, extremely professional restoration, done in a way that is done to protect the book from completely deteriorating. Now, it's one of those gray zones where what gets that conserved grade, what gets the restored like A level grade. And it really does come down to the materials used. A lot of the times you do color touch on a comic, even in that A level tier, it cannot be reversed. Well, with conserved grade, the color touch can be removed. It's usually done with water soluble paints. So that's one thing, that one example. For example, tear seals being replaced with Tengojo paper, that can be removed, and therefore it's done purely to conserve the book and not for aesthetic reasons. That's kind of the way that they view it. So generally, you have the conserved being the highest form of restoration. Now, here's the weird thing about all that. I say all this, and then I'm going to totally throw it out the window, because when you ask me the question, what is the most or least preferable, well, then it becomes something very strange, because what we have is green labels with signatures. Well, those are actually preferred, because people realize that, hey, that's probably a real signature, just CGC didn't grade it as such. Now that things are changing, maybe they will recognize it. The other thing with green labels is sometimes it's just a coupon cut or something like that, or a piece missing from the back or something. Usually it's a coupon cut or a page missing. Now that can have bigger or smaller effects. Good example of that is Hulk 181, where you have often the case the coupon or Marvel stamp being removed, and that will generally reduce the price by about half. So about half. Restored copies usually can range in value from, you always go by, like with all these, it's a percentage of the value of a blue label. So if a blue label is worth $1,000 in that grade, then a green label is worth generally about a half. Like this is, not 100%, because there's times where it's kind of iffy. So usually about half with the green label. Now restored like A, B, and C will have percentages. The higher the grade, though, with restored, generally what will happen is the less you'll get return on it. For example, if it's a 9.8 restored book, generally you only get about 10% of that value because it's restored. However, if it's like a 2.0, you might get about 90% of the value for even though it's restored. So it's really weird how that works. It's almost like the higher it gets, the worse it is that it's restored. And that's because of perception. Because the perception is that if the book is really, really high grade and there's restoration, well, maybe it was the restoration that got it up to that high grade. And also, if you tried, like, let's say it's color touch, and it's a 9.8. Well, if you remove color touch, and generally that means actually removing pieces from the book, there's no way that it's going to get a 9.8. It's probably not even going to get a 7.0. So the value really gets hurt by the restoration, because to remove that restoration, it really will reduce the grading of that book. So now, how does conservation come into play? Well, conservation is one of those things where there's just not enough slabs that have been conserved for really a market to be established. So generally when I see conserved books, I see them going for about half on, like, pretty much across any grade, as much as the blue label. So in certain cases, the purple label can actually sell for more than the conserved label, which is odd, but it's true. It's one of those weird things that I've seen many times, actually. It's just that the conserved grades don't necessarily hold the value as much as you would expect. They get about 50%, and in certain grades, 50% is less than what the purple label would have gotten. It's one of those weird things. I can't explain it, but that is the way. Now, why did Jerry's books get the conserved grade? Well, as I said, it's back to his process. So he does recognize techniques that are considered conservation techniques. So I'm actually going to be talking to Jerry tonight as I'm recording this, and talking to him about restoration, about his processes, and about conserved grades. And that interview with Jerry will be airing not this weekend, but next weekend. So look forward to that. Make sure you're subbed to this channel so you don't miss it, because it's going to be a good interview. Jerry's a really interesting guy, and we've been friends for a while now. So definitely check that video when it drops. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks again for asking. Next question comes from Quasi Terrible. Do you know the movie The Room? Yes, I do. Tommy Wiseau movie. It's so bad that it's great. What is your favorite The Room comic version you own, where it's so bad it is good? Mine would be Ghost Rider Wolverine Weapons of Vengeance Alpha. Well, okay, so there's a bunch I'm going to show that are comics that I have in my collection that are kind of bad but good. And some are for nostalgic reasons, some are for just, I think they're kind of quirky characters that I think are cool, that often don't get the love that they deserve. And so I'm going to start with the nostalgic ones that are so bad that they're good. And we got monsters monster in my pocket. I think it's it's like it's kind of cheesy and silly, but I like it. I think it's kind of cool. This was a popular toy in the, I believe it's the 80s. I'm pretty sure it was back then. It's been a while. Yeah, you get these little monster toys that you put in your pocket. And I think they even had an animation series, and they made a comic of it. So, bit of nostalgia. And then another one that's nostalgia orientated. This one is kind of bad, but it is Ronald McDonald. And actually, a channel called Cali Comics, he showed me that he had this in his collection. I was like, oh wow, that's so cool. And I remember, like, as a kid, I'd eat a lot of McDonald's and get McDonald's toys, and I always remember seeing the clown dressed up as Ronald McDonald, and it was a thing. It was a popular thing, and they actually made 2 comics. I think it's like 2 or 3 comics actually. A series about Ronald McDonald, and it's like, this is from the 60s. Or actually 1970, sorry. Yeah, just what were they, like, would children be like, oh wow, Ronald McDonald, I gotta get that. So this is just kind of a silly comic, kind of bad, but kind of nostalgic and fun for that reason. Now, another series that I really, really do like, and people think kind of lowly of this series because it is such a quirky character, is Bullet Man. This is a Golden Age book, and I really like Bullet Man, but it's such a bad costume that he has, and like, he's got this bullet head. He looks like a cone head, and it's just kind of a quirky character, but there's something really charming about it, and actually the writing isn't that bad. It's actually quite well done, but it is very silly. You got Bullet Man, Bullet Girl, and Bullet Dog. Just very, very silly. But yeah, I like these quirky kind of characters. So those would be some of my bad but good ones. There was actually another one that I couldn't find. I was actually searching through my boxes to try to find it, but it's Skateboard Man, where his superpower is he has a skateboard and he whacks people with it. So it's pretty funny. So there are some pretty good ones. There's like a bunch that I actually used to be really into, like Scud, the Disposable Assassin. That's a really great series. There's so many of these like quirky series that some people would see, oh, that's really silly and lame, but I think are cool. So that's kind of the style I used to really like, especially during my university years. I really got into these quirkier characters, and I still collect that stuff. Okay, so next question comes from Dead Man, and he wrote, I hadn't noticed it before, but your shelves behind you is the tape keeping the books from falling. Okay, so yes, you can probably see it, actually. I'm kind of looking at it right now. You can see it especially on the Wonder Woman. You can see I was really taping that one. I taped it a lot because I was worried that it'd fall. So yeah, so what I do, it's a really lame system that I have, because the way the books stand up is, it's there, the space on the shelves is just enough that it'll kind of fit in, like almost like sort of by itself and stay. But when I thought, oh, this is staying really, really well by itself, and then I walked across the room and then the books fell. So I realized, no, they're not going to stay by themselves. I had to put something to prevent them from falling. Now, I know that some people, what they'll do is put like a fish line across, and that will sort of keep the books in place. But that only works if you have a bit of a lip on the shelves, which I don't. So I had to come up with a simple solution, and this was the simple solution: some tape. So I just, pop them off. The tape is on the bag, so it's not doing any damage. It's not hurting the books in any particular way. So it was a simple solution to getting them to stay there. So lame, but that was the only thing I could think of, like how to get them to stay. Okay, so next question comes from Mass Peanut. What is the most important item in your collection? For example, only thing you would keep, and what would it be? I really don't know, to tell you the truth. I actually really love all my books, but I did find one item that I really like, and it's something like, if I sold all my collection for some odd reason, I would still want to keep this one item, and it's my Vampirella toy. I actually really like this little, I always have it on display. I used to have it display in my office, and I always try to keep it near me. I just really like it. It's really cute. So you got the little Vampirella display, and it has like that has the bat, little Vampirella bat. And I actually bought this pre-painted, and the guy that did the painting did a really good job. Like, he gave her like mascara and stuff. Really well done. And even the way their mouth is done, and even the earrings. I think he painted is it earrings? Yeah. He kind of painted earrings onto you can't really see it. I don't know if you can see it, but if I turn it that way, you can see that he kind of painted as if she has earrings. And he painted her bracelet, and he even painted this slab that she's on with different rock, stone, and all this kind of stuff. Now, this would not, when you buy it, it is like just one tone. It's just the skin tone the whole way. But he did a really good job of painting it, and I really like it. So, yeah. So that's that's the one thing I'd keep, I guess. But I'd want to keep it all, to tell you the truth. So, hope that answers your question. Next question comes from Troy Evans. What do you think the next golden age trend will be after PCH, excluding Marvel and DC? Okay, so PCH right now is the hot thing, like really hot. It's kind of crazily hot. And it's kind of, maybe maxed out in a way, like in terms of how the prices have gone. And I do see it actually having weaknesses, as because people kind of overpaid into it a bit, especially with the EC comics. So there is that bit of waning to the PCH thing. So what will be next, right? Well, what will people search for after they're done with pre-code horror? Well, there are other things that are currently crazily hot. And one is a new artist, Dave Stevens, and one is an old artist, Matt Baker. And why does Dave Stevens have anything to do with Golden Age? Well, Dave Stevens did Good Girl art. Well, Matt Baker did Good Girl art as well. And a lot of the influences for Dave Stevens' art actually comes from Golden Age characters. For example, he did Airboy, and he did a really great cover. One of the more popular covers done by Dave Stevens is an Airboy cover. And that kind of popularity has sort of lent interest into the Golden Age, and helping artists like Matt Baker also becoming hot. So what I see is like this move to the good girl collecting. But where is a market within the good girl that has been kind of ignored for the most part? And what I see is the romance books as being that genre where it's been kind of ignored by comic collectors. Comic collectors, generally gravitate to boy interests, and romance books were generally geared towards girls. However, when boys discover a lot of these romance books, they realize, hey, they're actually cooler than you would have thought. especially even like non-Golden Age romance books are pretty cool. They got away with a lot of stuff. But the Golden Age the Good Girl and romance books have phenomenal artists like Matt Baker in them. So what's happening is you get people that are interested in the sexy girls that and the popularity of David Stevens stuff, and then you get also the popularity of these Golden Age artists like Matt Baker, and people are trying to find other like opportunities to buy his work but at an affordable price. Well, romance is kind of like that. There's a lot of affordable romance books that just happen to have Matt Baker art on the cover or interior. So a lot of good stuff there, and that's where I think people are going. And they're learning about different things within the romance things so that don't include even Matt Baker stuff, that have actually pretty cool artwork and stories. So I think Good Girl and romance books will maybe become a new trend because there's a lot of opportunities there because the books have been so undervalued for so long. So that's kind of where I see it going. Now, the last question comes from Matt Atkinson, and he wrote, didn't DC own independent news? Would they have been able to distribute regardless? So here's the thing. So the question comes from what happened with the Comic Code Authority, that basically if you didn't follow the Comic Code Authority, you weren't able to access distributors. You had to, you were basically locked out. And if you didn't have that access to distributors, you couldn't get on the newsstands. And that was a real problem. Now, DC had its own distribution wing, which was independent news. And independent news was a pretty major distributor. Why didn't DC just say, oh, we're not going to do the Comic Code. We can do our own thing. Well, the reason they didn't do that is the reason the Comic Code Authority came in the first place. Because at the time, parents were freaking out that comics were destroying kids, and it looked like all comics were going to be put to an end if something wasn't done. If something wasn't done to assure parents that these comics were, something safe for their kids to read. And the Comic Code Authority was kind of built by DC, Marvel, EC Comics, and a few of the others that basically came together and said, okay, here are the rules that will make comics acceptable to parents. And so DC really bought into that ideology, and it was another form of enforcement for the distribution. Now, DC, its independent news actually was a fairly major distributor. It distributed DC comics and magazines. It also distributed Marvel, Playboy, and ACG. So it actually distributed a bunch of comics. And I was surprised that it distributed Playboy as well. And also distributed Family Circle. So the point is, it wanted to follow the rules of the Comic Code Authority, and also it was actually really interesting when I looked into independent news, and some of the stuff it did was it was a distributor from 1932 to 1970, and at the time during the 50s, when this crazy code stuff was happening, you had American News Company being the number one distributor. It was massive. It was basically a monopoly because only Marvel and DC were kind of free from it. There was a few other companies that had other methods of distributing, but really American News Company was like 90% of the market. It just dominated the distribution market. And it actually went through this phase where it was being under like investigation for monopoly concerns. And what happened was Marvel had its own distribution wing through Atlas from 1952 to 1957. But then they decided, hey, there's this American news company that just seems to have all the access, will distribute through them. So, but then there was this whole thing about the monopoly element of American News Company, and American News Company lost the lawsuit, and basically it got put out of business. So all of a sudden, Marvel had no distribution for its comics, and they actually went to DC, to Independent News, as its distributor. And Marvel was actually really annoyed to have to go to DC in order to get its distribution, or this Independent News distributor. And because they were such rivals, Independent News actually put really harsh restrictions on Marvel when it was publishing through this Independent News, or distributing through this Independent News. And basically, Marvel, prior to the distribution through Independent News, was putting out about 40 to 60 publications per month, different titles. After, because of the restrictions that Independent News put into play, they went down to 8 to 12 titles. Just devastated the company. But if they didn't follow those rules, they wouldn't have been able to distribute anything. So they kind of had to go with it. So I just thought that was an extra little aside. But Independent News ended up itself disappearing when it was bought out by the Kinney National Company in 1967, and then later that was bought out by Warner Brothers and Warner Publishing, and once that happened, it just sort of disappeared inside this big, massive company, and went defunct in 1970. So that was the end of DC's distribution wing. So that's the story of Independent News. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, and remember to subscribe to the channel. And if you have a question, put it in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.